I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, upcoming Palestinian elections scheduled to take place on October 8th on both the West Bank and in Gaza. This will be the first time in over 10 years, since 2006, that both Palestinian communities will be holding elections simultaneously. Now, you may remember that in 2006, President Bush is said to have pushed for elections in Gaza. And in a surprise victory, Hamas won out over Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And that led to a wave of violence against members of Fatah in Gaza and resulted in Fatah giving up all influence in and control of the Gaza Strip. What might the upcoming Palestinian elections mean for the Palestinian community and for the Middle East as a whole? One man who's expressed some real concern that there could be similar disasters this October is one of America's foremost diplomats, having served as Assistant Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan and as Deputy National Security Advisor for George W. Bush, Elliott Abrams, who now serves as a Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Elliott, it's so good to have you back on JBS.
It's my pleasure.
So, Elliott, what does concern you about these upcoming October Palestinian elections?
Well, you remember the famous phrase of Yogi Berra, deja vu all over again. In 2006, they went to elections and Hamas won. And I guess that's the simple way of putting what concerns me. The Fatah party is no better than it was 10 years ago. They have used these 10 years to do nothing. And it's reasonable to believe that they'll lose to Hamas again.
Yes.
And that's what concerns me.
On the West Bank as well as in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, in Gaza, it's different. Because in Gaza, they won't really have a free election at all. In the West Bank, they might have a reasonably free election, and voters are, fed up with the corruption and the repression of Fatah. I mean, why did Fatah lose 10 years ago? They lost because people were fed up with corruption. They lost because people were fed up with repression by the Palestinian Authority. They lost partly because some people actually want to vote for Hamas, either because they're more religious and they think Fatah is true secular, or because they like the idea of killing Jews and think that Hamas is better at it. So you add all that up together, and Hamas won 10 years ago. There's no particular reason to think they might not win. In fact, let me add one other factor. Hamas is smart. So in a municipality, they'll have one candidate. Fatah is divided. They might have 5 guys running who will split the non- or anti-Hamas vote, so they lose because they're so disorganized. That happened 10 years ago. It can happen again.
You also write that there's something sort of either ironic or unfair in the fact that a terrorist group like Hamas is able to run an election on the West Bank, but they really don't allow Fatah to run candidates freely in Gaza, so that the Gaza election is hardly an election. And you raise the question, well, what's the symmetry here? If Hamas doesn't allow Fatah to run in Gaza, why is Fatah allowing Hamas to run on the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, it's a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose situation. In neither case is it a 100% free election, but it's worse in Gaza. And the degree of pressure is greater in Gaza. I'll add one other thing here, which is, why is a terrorist group being permitted to run at all? This is a debate we had in 2006. We came out in the wrong place. And this should be not just a matter of Hamas, Israel, Palestinians. It should be a matter of principle. If a terrorist group is willing to lay down its arms, this would be the case of Northern Ireland. That was the deal that was made with the IRA. Lay down your arms, give up the armed struggle, enter politics. And it has worked in Northern Ireland. But nobody is saying that to Hamas. Nobody is saying, give up terrorism, then you can run. They're being permitted to continue all the terrorism. They don't turn in one pistol, but they can run.
Very interesting. You also point out the Palestinians are split, you say. The Palestinian national government and a national movement inside the Palestinian world are divided. And you talk about how Hamas's brand of rejectionism and terror does remain widely popular. What is your sense of the sentiment among the Palestinian people when it comes to choosing between Hamas and Fatah? And Elliott, if you're saying that there is a significant number of average Palestinians who will vote for Hamas because of terrorism, what's that say to you about the potentials for a peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis?
I think it is the case that a substantial number of Palestinians are going to vote for Hamas. You might say, on principle, because it's Islamist and because it's terrorist. And there are some other polls that suggest, if you ask about the peaceful two-state solution, in principle, you'd get about half Palestinians saying yes and half of them saying no. I think that the existence of such a large group of Palestinians who support Hamas and who think it is justifiable to use terrorism. Let's say what that means. It is justifiable to kill Israelis, men, women, and children, to achieve their political goals. What that tells you is peace is not at hand. The people who think that, it's always an inch away, to just get back to the table. Nonsense. Not happening.
There's a common understanding that the United States sort of forced the Palestinians into the 2006 elections. Elliott, is that true?
No, it's not. And, I'm glad you asked that question because it's a myth. I see it. I read the Israeli press, and every once in a while you see somebody just mentioning it as if everybody knows it's a fact. Here's what happened. Arafat died in the fall of 2004, and the Fatah party and the PLO selected Mahmoud Abbas as his successor. They wanted to have a presidential election because how do you legitimize this guy? How do you choose a successor to Arafat and give him some prestige? And they said, we'll have an election. So they had an election. They had an election in January 2005, and it went pretty well. Observers said pretty fair election. They had about 70% turnout. People were allowed to run against Abbas and say, don't vote for him, don't vote for me. He won about 65% of the vote, which is very low for an Arab election. These are the days when Mubarak is getting 99%, Assad is getting 99%. He didn't. So they said, this is a very good experiment. Okay, so this is a success. Let's do it again at the parliamentary level. Let's have a parliamentary election, a legislative election, in June. We're in 2005 here. They couldn't get their act together, so they postponed it to January 2006. That's when they held it. That's the election Hamas won. They wanted to have these elections because they thought it helps our prestige. It shows everyone we're winning, that we have the confidence of the Palestinian people, and we're democratic. Therefore, we should have our own state. It's a message to the Israelis. We're mature. We're ready for peace. We're ready for independence and sovereignty. So they wanted to do it. It's true that they got very nervous at the end. They thought they were going to win. They were sure they were going to win. All the polls said they were going to win. The Israelis told us, relax. Hamas has no chance of winning. Until the last couple of weeks, when people began to see, Hamas is rising and rising and rising. It's not 20%. It's not 25. Now it's more than 30. Now it's more than 35. They got scared, and they wanted Sharon or Bush to call off the election. And Sharon said no. I mean, Sharon's view was, you want to cancel the election, cancel the election. You're not going to blame it on me. And Bush's view was, I'm not calling off an election 3 days before the election because you think you're going to lose it.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead with it. President Bush's view turned out to be wrong. He said after the election, look, this is a message from the Palestinian people of no confidence in the Fatah party. And this will wake them up.
Mm-hmm.
This is a call in the night that will wake them up. They'll reorganize. It'll turn them into a real political party. It didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
The Fatah party of today is the same old corrupt bunch of 10 years ago.
Fascinating. Elliott, is Abbas a legitimate, democratically elected president? Everybody makes fun of the fact he is in the 10th year of a 4-year term.
Yeah.
But as far as the Palestinians on the West Bank are concerned, is he a legitimate, democratically elected president?
Well, I think you can't say that he is today. When he was elected, actually 11 years ago now, January 2005, and has never submitted himself to the voters since then. He's as legitimate as anybody in that system. I mean, there's nobody who is more legitimate because they haven't. It's not as if they held an election a few years ago and he threw out the result. But I don't think you can say that somebody who has stayed and stayed and stayed and refused to submit himself to the voters is today a legitimate leader.
Mm-hmm. Now, what happens, in your view, Elliott, if in fact Hamas wins on the West Bank? Doesn't that turn everything upside down?
Well, these are municipal elections.
Yes.
So it isn't as if they would have a Hamas president or a Hamas parliament all of a sudden. But it would make a big difference. If you have a bunch of big towns, Jenin, Nablus, Hebron, Ramallah, and so forth, the towns in the West Bank, if some of these bigger towns come under a Hamas mayor, first of all, it's going to make cooperation with us or with Israel or with many other countries much more difficult. And it also says, the whole political system is rotten. It's a reminder. If people are voting against the incumbents, then you have to assume that, okay, if they had a presidential or legislative election, you'd get pretty much the same outcome. And that tells you the Palestinians are, first of all, fed up with their own leadership, but it may also suggest, as we were talking a few minutes ago, they're not oriented toward peace. They're oriented toward Hamas.
From your position,
pretty bad news.
Yeah, it is, by the way. From the position you have at the Council on Foreign Relations, when you look at the Middle East in its entirety, to what extent do you say to yourselves, this is utter chaos? To what extent do you see pockets of stability which give you hope for the future of the Middle East?
There are some pockets of stability, and for the most part, it's the monarchies, plus Tunisia, and of course Israel. I mean, but Tunisia, tiny country, but it's a democracy. Things are working well, and that's the real hope for the Arab future. But the monarchies are working. I mean, no king, whatever the title is, Sultan, Sheikh, has been overthrown. These governments appear to be, in the eyes of their own people, reasonably legitimate. In fact, I think if you look at Jordan, let's say, which is so important to Israel, I think things are safer than they were a few years ago, because I think a lot of Jordanians look around at Lebanon, at Syria, at Iraq, and they say, whoa, we do not want that. Our system is better. Let's keep what we have. Let's stay with this system, with the king. He's keeping us safe. I think you see that in Morocco. I think you see it in the Gulf as well. Obviously, they have a great advantage there of having lots of oil revenue. But I think you see where you see chaos, of course, is Iraq, Syria, to some extent, Lebanon, which are really falling apart.
Mm.
And the one kind of positive impact of all of that is that the Israelis and Arabs are now looking at each other, the Israelis and Egyptians, Israelis, Jordanians, and now the Israelis and the Gulf Arabs are looking at each other not as enemies, but as people who have significant common interests against the jihadis, against Iran, and in favor of stability in the region. And we have seen little steps, tiny steps, at least in public, but clearly something is up in the improvement of Israeli-Arab relations.
It is an ironic twist of fate, don't you think?
Yes, it really is. And no, of course, no one predicted this,
right.
But very striking. You had a Saudi delegation in Jerusalem recently, unofficial, but they wouldn't have gone unless the government approved it. Not just one person, a delegation. They met with Dory Gold and a number of others. You have Israel opening a diplomatic establishment in Abu Dhabi, accredited to a UN agency there, not the government of Abu Dhabi, but nevertheless, it's there with Israeli diplomats. We know that Israeli-Jordanian and Israeli-Egyptian security relations are probably better than they've ever been. So it is an irony, but here's one at least that's positive and helpful to Israel. And I think that gives us some hope, because it's not going to disappear. This is not a flash in the pan, I think. One of the things that, of course, the Palestinians don't like about this is, what are the Arabs doing? They're looking out for their own interests, obviously. And that means that for them, the Palestinian issue is not only not at the top priority, it's hardly a priority at all. So the Palestinians are, clamoring for attention, but the Arab states, this is not new, but the Arab states are looking out for their own interests, and their own interests align them more and more with Israel.
I want to ask you a different kind of question because of all the experience you've had and when you've had it. The question is raised all the time now, whether in fact Saudi Arabia is a legitimate ally of the United States. We seem to need Saudi Arabia. At the same time, we're told, Elliott, that Saudi Arabia is one of the largest sponsors of terrorism. We're reminded time and time again that many of those who were part of 9/11 came from, were supported by, and trained in Saudi Arabia. And that the Saudi Arabian system is so anti-West and is, in fact, the seat of much of hardline, extreme Muslim ideology. Now, there is even suggestion that the man you worked for, President Bush, had a very close personal tie to many who were involved in Saudi Arabia. As you look at the Middle East, as you look at the dynamic of jihadist philosophy now leading to a certain kind of horrific violence, what is your advice to Americans who ask you, what should American attitude and policy be towards Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that of course, we have a lot of common interests with the Saudis now, particularly in fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Iran. So I would say there's no question that we have common interests that we can build on. We also have some common economic interests. The days when the government of Saudi Arabia was spending billions and billions of dollars promoting, let's call it extremism, I think are over. There's still plenty of money coming out of the Gulf that is promoting extremism, but it's individual radicals, not the government of Saudi Arabia. We need to continue to push them because they have not sufficiently cleaned up their act. If you talk to people, let's say in places from Indonesia to Kosovo, the Saudis are still supporting mosques and imams and school books that are much too radical. They're not as radical as they were 10 or 20 years ago. They're still much too radical. There's much more that needs to be done. I don't think we are actually pushing them hard enough. Frankly, the Obama administration can't. Not just because it's a lame duck, but they have no faith in the Obama administration because of Iran and other things. But I think it's something for the next administration to do. Rebuild the relationship there, but rebuild it with the demand that they do more to clean up the textbooks, the sermons, the imams. If you there are many countries. I believe Morocco is a good example. They won't allow Saudi preachers. They say no thanks. We'll do our own because so many of them are radical. And the Saudi government, now the government is largely run by the king's son in his 30s. They've got the tiger by the tail because I think they do want to clean some of this up, but of course they've created a situation where there are millions of Saudis who don't want to clean it up. They have the clergy, who are really, for the most part, very backward. So they've got the reformers there have a tough situation on their hands. We need to push them to keep moving in the right direction.
Very interesting. All right, you wrote an important book, Elliott, Tested by Zion. In it, you wrote a good deal about the failed Camp David talks between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak. I hear constantly questions about why did those talks fail. An Israeli journalist, Avi Izakharov, has written that shortly after Arafat walked out of Camp David, he in fact was ready to continue negotiating, and that his walkout was simply a negotiating tactic. Do you accept that analysis of what happened that ultimately derailed Camp David, that in fact, while Arafat did in the end walk out, the walkout was not nearly as dramatic as that walkout has been depicted in history?
Yeah, no, I think that's really false. No doubt there were a number of reasons why Camp David failed. I mean, even people in the Clinton administration will say, we should have done this and Clinton should have done that, and Barack mishandled it, and all of that. There's a lot to be said there, and I can criticize Barack and so forth. That's not the bottom line. Camp David failed because Yasser Arafat was never going to sign an agreement. And you can look at what Dennis Ross, who is one of the leading proponents of Camp David and a key figure there, has written repeatedly since then. And I agree with it, and I think, by the way, and I've said to American officials after the Annapolis meeting, it applies as well to the current leadership, to Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas is never going to sign anything. Arafat was never going to sign anything. Why not? First of all, fear of Hamas, fear that they would call him a traitor, that they would kill him. And as Dennis has said, Arafat was never going to be able to transform himself from, in his own view, a great warrior, military leader, into a statesman. Some people have. I mean, Nelson Mandela did, George Washington did. These were people who could lead a fight and then end the fight.
Mm-hmm.
Menachem Begin did. This is not Arafat. Mm-hmm. Arafat was a terrorist who could not possibly convert himself into a democratic leader or any kind of political leader where you have to build schools, build hospitals, collect the garbage. This was not Arafat. He was never going to be able to do this. If you think that, you could have sweetened this little term and you could have sweetened that, he was never going to sign. And by the way, Olmert sweetened a lot of these things. The deal Olmert offered them was much more liberal than the deal that Barack offered Arafat. And Abbas also said no. So I think the bottom line is clear. Arafat was never going to sign. Yes, we could have had different tactics. Yes, Barack could have done this and this. Clinton could have done this and that. I don't think it matters.
And what about those who argue that the Oslo process proved that Arafat and the Palestinians really were willing to make peace with Israel, were willing to accept the notion that all conflict would be resolved, accepting a limited right of return, and that Oslo proves that there can be peace with the Palestinians. What do you know and feel about the truth of Oslo?
It's a very hard and very interesting question, but you know it's 2016. People have been trying for a very long time to turn the Oslo process into peace, and they haven't failed because they're stupid, and they haven't failed because they're not the Israelis, the Americans really don't want peace to be achieved. So I think the problem is the Palestinians wanted a process, but they have not been willing to make compromises to actually get the peace. Or as some people have put it, they value their grievances more than they value getting a state.
Mm-hmm.
And contrast this to the Zionists. After all, they didn't get everything they wanted in 1947 when the UN and the British were beginning to do the end of the British mandate. But they said, yes, we'll get started. And, Ben Gurion was willing to accept a tiny little statement. We have to get started. Palestinians have never been willing to do that, and they are still not willing to do that. There was a poll taken in August. And if you ask Palestinians, do you want the two-state solution, do you want peace? 51% say yes. It's not such a great number, but okay. But then when you get to asking about the specifics, now a peace agreement means, of course, you don't get all of Jerusalem and the Israelis get the Western Wall. No. And, peace agreement does not mean the right of return, so-called. Palestinians are going to be able to go to Palestine, but not to, no. So when you get down to actually doing the compromises, the support on the Palestinian side is not there.
Elliott, it is always wonderful to learn from you and talk to you. I appreciate so much. You've heard this from me before. I appreciate so much that you try to make time for JBS and the JBS audience. You're doing fabulous work. I will continue to chase you. Excellent piece on this. And again, thank you, my friend, for all you do.
Thanks very much, Mark. Great to talk to you.
Be well. Elliott Abrams, a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, editor, Dennis Golan, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.